Good evening, everybody. The year 2014 was a pivotal one in the world of video games. Not only did the 8th console generation begin in earnest, it contained unforeseen controversy, releases classic and crushing, and, most importantly of all, the debut of the NewsCube podcast. Gaming in 2014 tore itself apart in a way that hasn't really been seen since the darkest days of the Sony-Nintendo console wars. But before we get to that, we need to start with January, when there was one thing everyone could agree on, that nobody can control an octopus with a mouse. Before you start to understand that as a weird interspecies romance, we're talking about Octodad Dadliest Catch, a bizarre and bizarrely popular cephalopod from Young Horses Inc. The player takes the role of Octodad, an octopus in disguise as a human, living in a suburban household with his wife and children. Before he has time to settle in, or you have time to wonder how on earth he made the babies and she didn't notice something, the piece is shattered by the constant anti-octopus machinations of the evil chef Fujimoto, intent on capturing, cooking and serving Octodad. With various locations and tasks, including shopping at a supermarket, mowing the lawn, and sneaking aboard a fishing trawler in the midst of a storm, Octodad offers a range of challenges, all of which are complicated by the difficult-to-control nature of the game's protagonist. Octodad has no bones, so can only be flung in an unwieldy fashion by dragging his limbs around with the mouse buttons, and despite the screen-smashingly frustrating nature of the task, there's a huge chunk of satisfaction to be gained by finally getting it. The game loses marks for its short story campaign, since only half a dozen proper locations were included, but the level creator adds bags of fun for the sort of sad sack who sits staring slack-jawed at stacks of physics objects for them to frustrate their family and friends through. It's a shame in some ways that Octodad is a really good game, because it means that I can't honestly say that, like its protagonist, it sucks. The Banner Saga is a game about Vikings, but which is better known for being threatened with legal action by King.com, the creators of Candy Crush Saga, who presumably feared children around the world confusing hairy sweets with tasty Vikings. Wait, what? The game consists of turn-based, squad-based, beard-faced combat in the vein of things like Final Fantasy Tactics, and it's all presented in a rather lovely cartoon graphical style, with the Nordic slaughter all the prettier to watch as a result. The bleak soundtrack adds some much appreciated polish to the whole Scandinavia affair and is almost worth buying the game for in its own right. If you like a man with a beard who knows how to swing his axe and you have a thing for warrior gods, you could do a lot worse than relationship counselling. Short of that though, you can satisfy yourself by buying Banner Saga. After a Kickstarter campaign that was nothing short of a cash-pocalypse, raising $3 million in the space of a month, exemplars of good games industry luck Double Fine Productions fired another salvo of independent gameplay into the unsuspecting faces of the mainstream production monoliths. And before you ask, no, I haven't gone too far with that metaphor, this was Broken Age. Broken Age follows two protagonists through separate but simultaneous adventures. The maiden Vela escapes her planned sacrifice and sets out on a long journey across multiple fantasy lands filled with bird people, a surprisingly human god and a hipster lumberjack to destroy the monster which has terrorized her land and people for centuries. Meanwhile, Shay, a teenage boy, works pointless tasks on a spaceship day in and day out for a mollycoddling computer deluded into thinking it's his mother, before a mysterious fox who isn't all he seems arrives on the scene and throws a proverbial spanner into the works. The stories were well written and had a fun level of mystery, although the final twist can be worked out well before it arrives, and loses some of its impact as a result. The characters of Shay and Vela were genuinely sympathetic and realistic in a way Tim Schafer seems to have a particular knack for, and an all-star voice cast including Elijah Wood, Masasa Moyo, Will Wheaton and Jennifer Hale performed admirably in bringing across the sense of a world not quite as it first appears. The first episode ended with intrigue, surprise and confusion, which with the second instalment on the way means we have a lot to look forward to. Despite some overly simple puzzles and an over-reliance on dialogue trees, Broken Age is, despite its name, a solid and well put together title which harkens back to the best days of Ben Throttle and Manny Calavera for maximum appeal to Schafer fans. February is traditionally known as containing a metric ton of absolutely bloody nothing, which is why it was so surprising this year that despite such wonders as Basement Crawl, Steel Diver, Sub Wars and Naissance, there were actually games out this month that people had heard of and cared about, at least if they were the kind of tiresome nerd who watches these videos. The second sequel to Final Fantasy XIII, which should itself be called Final Fantasy XIV, making the sequel Final Fantasy XVI, came out in the middle of February. It was called Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, as well she might, given how big a turd the first one was. But why would she be buying a game about herself anyway, the egomaniac? Anyway, it was your fairly standard Final Fantasy sequel, the basic stand in a row flinging attacks at each other so numbers fall out until one side fades and dies model, although they did mix things up a little by awarding different combat advantages and disadvantages based on what kind of pretty outfit the characters are wearing. I wish I was joking. The whole game runs on some kind of Majora's Mask-style timed system, only rendered shitty by the inability to rewind, which gives the impression of the game chivying you along at every turn, as if they don't want you to explore the lovely world they spent many months and millions of dollars building. The plot's about as bananas as Banana Man drinking a banana milkshake on a Caribbean banana plantation, and won't get much detailing here because I couldn't recite it without 4 flowcharts and a 6-pack of Red Bull to keep me awake. In short, if you like watching your PS3 strain under the pressure of squeezing every last drop of graphical effects out of its processor, then you can add your drop of spare change to the Square Enix money bin. Just don't be surprised if, unlike every other Final Fantasy character's best friend, love interest or family member, this series just won't fucking die. Plants vs Zombies, the Flash-style tower defense game which somehow bumbled its way into fistfuls of cash, had mixed success with its first proper sequel, Plants vs Zombies Garden Warfare. An adaptation into a Team Fortress 2-style wacky shooter was always a risky venture, and the end result was okay, but with sufficient flaws and sufficiently different from the original that it didn't light the world on fire in quite the same way. The nutty, colourful and unpredictable jazz punk splattered its glittery self all over the PC, as did Bravely Default, a 3DS JRPG following in the grand traditions of the genre by assembling its title from 2 utterly unconnected words plucked at random from the nearest dictionary. Tales of Symphonia Chronicles rewarded long-time fans of the original game with an HD re-release on PS3, which brought the lovingly crafted watercolour-style graphics and brilliantly fun combat system to a whole new generation, but the other big news of February was not in such a happy vein, as we shall now find out. Irrational Games, an illustrious player in the PC gaming industry, were responsible for the oppressive horror of System Shock 2 and Bioshock, as well as most famously and recently the swashbuckling, physics-bending, high-altitudinal silliness of Bioshock Infinite. Despite giving birth to these critical darlings which sold solidly, the studio shut down suddenly at the tail end of February, leading some critics to herald the death knell of the traditional developer-publisher model. Personally, I think such hyperbolic proclamations come too soon, and you could almost call them irrational. The big stink kicked up in March, other than the collective BO of the neckbeards who descended on GDC 2014, was over Facebook paying $2 billion to buy up Oculus Rift, the originally crowdfunded VR headset that's inspired so many delightful videos of people on YouTube whose talent is outstripped by their ownership of an Elgato and a webcam yelling in our faces at things which aren't particularly scary but which almost make them endearing to some people. It makes them look like a cutie pie. Anyway, people were largely making a scene as a result of Facebook's decidedly dodgy personal data practices, which led Notch, creator of Minecraft, to cancel the game for the device and call Facebook creepy. Fair enough, I reckon, although I suspect the bigger risk is 3D VR Farmville, which will grant a whole new dimension in which that one friend can annoy you. On to the games, and in an unsurprising turn of events for the year, the choice was pretty limited. South Park The Stick of Truth made a decent poo-covered stab at things with a reasonably funny RPG that succeeded mostly by ripping off Paper Mario, and by courting that old mistress controversy with an alien anal probing scene which was consequently banned in Australia. Our Antipodean cousins will come up later, but the replacement scene for that region ended up being approximately 4 times as funny as the original tired gag, so kudos to the Australian Office of Film and Literature Classification for improving the game on that one. And because that's not a very funny sentence, Willy Bum Poo Knickers. Dark Souls 2 rounded off the lifespan of the Xbox 360 and PS3 by kicking so many players' asses the number of actual bodily harm cases soared for weeks afterwards. It's always been a question mark hanging over the game as to whether it's actually hard or whether games like Call of Duty handhold to the degree where it's alone in being remotely challenging. However, I haven't played the game, so here's a limerick about it instead. It's a fight for those wider than tall, who wear neckbeards with hats far too small. So I won't be discussing all that pointless cussing, now let us get back on the ball. Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes earns a mention this month, but only in the way judges sometimes make an example of the guilty. This glorified demo had the barefaced cheek to sell itself as a full game, and with a running time just topping the 3-hour mark, its price tag was taking the proverbial urine. If you've any ambitions for working in the games industry, have the dignity and integrity not to so blatantly rip off your customers. Konami must know that when Metal Gear Solid 5 comes out properly, they'll be showered in money in the genitals of their choice, so to turn on the cash pipeline early is both greedy and unnecessarily angers people who might have paid for the full thing down the line. There's nothing wrong with demos, but I'm old and crusty enough at not even 20 years old to remember when demos were a whole quarter of a game that turned up taped to the front of a glossy games magazine. Back in those days, any developer with balls big enough to try that would have swiftly been murdered and turned into 2 space hoppers. Past the quarter point of the year, we ran into one of the least funny things to happen on April 1st since US Marines landed on Okinawa. Goat Simulator was the coded representation of the people who say the word lol instead of laughing, which inexplicably made the entire internet debase itself in delight. The premise of the game is that you are a goat who runs around a small buggy world smashing things and playing with physics toys that don't quite work. "But it's a simulator," says Idiot A. "It's supposed to be bad." No, 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 Idiot A. The appeal of Surgeon Simulator, and there definitely was some, was that it was very difficult because of its control scheme, and it presented a hilarious and nearly impossible challenge. It was the gaming equivalent of one of those obstacle courses manlier men than me go on to prove themselves. It was artfully constructed to test the player's reflexes and tolerance for frustration. Goat Simulator, by contrast, is a game with no reason to exist, which is only there for people to point at and say, "Lol, so random." True parody games are like a well-told joke. Goat Simulator is almost literally like a man on stage shouting an assortment of random swear words thrown together with no context or structure. He's not a comedian, he's just escaped his home. The elements of comedy are in there, but a pile of bricks and cement is not a house. In the absence of any news except Gabe and Tycho's money pile growing ever deeper, the month was bookended with Child of Light, the indie game that wasn't. A 2.5D platform RPG, it looked as though it could have come from a team of 6 nerds working in a basement when actually it was a major release from Ubisoft. With pretty washed out graphics and clever combat mechanics, Child of Light told a rather compelling story which a rhyming couplet style of storytelling helped turn into a lovely children's book to boot. It's well worth a play if you're the sort of person who likes Little Big Planet and Paper Mario and wishes the two can be combined, although I realise at this point I'm just talking to myself. In May, Nintendo demonstrated the inherent danger in allowing online content to pad out a game to the annoyance of millions. The creaky and awkward Nintendo Wi-Fi connection, much mocked for its reliance on antiquated friend codes and a lack of decent games, was finally closed down. While it doesn't immediately sound as though it would be much mourned, the closure specifically hit players of the DS Pokemon games, who can now no longer transfer their monsters to the newer games except through an arduous process and who couldn't complete the old game's Pokédex without cheating or knowing someone's sad enough to have already done it. Some people suspect a conspiracy to coerce players into buying new games. I don't really buy that, but there's something a bit coincidental about how they did it just before distracting all their customers with flashy new games at E3. The game tap turned and started to trickle during May as the big guns fired for the beginning of the Summer Games Rush. Sir, You Are Being Hunted was a bizarre survival game in which a character trapped in some kind of nightmarish steampunk world found themselves chased as a human game by a gang of murderous robots, so just like a normal night out in Barnsley. After the return of a few fan favourites with Kirby Triple Deluxe, Mario Golf World Tour and Tesla Effect, a new Tex Murphy adventure, the major game story of May came after 2 years of hype and speculation in the form of Watch Dogs, one of Ubisoft's 2 major launches, and generator of the meh heard round the world. Despite pitching itself in a standout E3 trailer some time ago as a free-flowing sandbox with huge potential for interacting with the game world's technology, the end result was severely limited in what you could do. The hacking was dumbed down to the point where it only consisted of endless QuickTime events, and some odd design decisions took the player out of the action to quite a large degree. For instance, here we can vault over the grave of our dead niece in a rather hilarious example of gaming's favourite term, ludonarrative dissonance. Well, I suppose you were supposed to be getting over her death. This is the part of the show where we'd normally discuss E3, but since it's so boring and you probably already know what came out, we decided to do things a little bit differently. A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, 4. E3's the very model of a modern gaming spectacle. It's full of scripted trailers trying hard to look respectable. We'll cover every aspect of exciting new announcements, and we'll talk about Ubisoft, EA, Sony and Nintendo. Microsoft took first turn and showed off Tomb Raider and Dragon Age. Assassin's Creed Unity met with co-op gender balance rage. The Witcher 3, the Master Chief Collection, Sunset Overdrive. Nobody's buying Xbox One, but that might change with Halo 5. Then EA took the stage and sequeled Mass Effect and Mirror's Edge. Just like other ME, they bring fatigue and aching of the head. In short, their poor attempts to make mundanity acceptable embody an example of the modern gaming spectacle. The Ubisoft appearance brought back some faith in the industry. The crew valiant hearts and Far Cry 4 balanced out Unity. They showed off Clancy Siege and You Just Dance, but let's not dwell on that, and did a pretty decent job of not looking like greedy twats. The Sony presentation gave us racist pleasing PS4s. The Dark Souls Devs new project Bloodborne pleased those on the conference floor. Announcements too were shown for Little Big Planet, Uncharted 4. And No Man's Sky and Destiny and GTA and many more. Nintendo didn't do a presentation cause they're much too cool. They showed it all online and fished again within their sequel pools. You're still impressed by Mario, their endless cash receptacle, then you deserve all you get from the modern gaming spectacle. Those were the only ones which got on stage or online broadcast. And there might have been some others, but I frankly couldn't care less. E3 Games! And in this week's Things That Never Should Have Been Shoehorned Together, Airtight Games, creators of Quantum Conundrum, created some sort of hybrid between LA Noire and Beyond Two Souls and called it Murdered Soul Suspect. It followed the ghost of a murdered detective as he floated around the astral realm trying to work out the motivation for and perpetrator of his own death. The inability to interact directly with most objects made for some interesting detective work puzzles, but it was let down by tacked on and frustrating stealth and combat sequences. Tomodachi Life came out for the 3DS after much wrangling over the rather senseless decision not to allow players to form same-sex relationships. It's most often been compared to Animal Crossing, but I'm not sure that's true. It's a lot more like sitting on The Sims, making Sims of all your friends and seeing if you can make them woohoo. The paradox of that, of course, is that the sort of person who does that has no friends. It went down reasonably well, and the ads are still running on TV over here, so they must have been doing something right, or a large proportion of the population of Britain are big gay-hating bastards. Ubisoft's Valiant Hearts found its way to our machines at the end of the month and served as a poignant retelling of the First World War and the centenary of its outbreak by taking us through the personal stories of several protagonists and one cute dog. It had some excellent gameplay variety and puzzles as well as storytelling, and the pop-up book art style softened the presentation while not detracting from the depth and emotions involved. Its supplementary information was deep and varied, and it really showed off the potential for games as an educational medium as well as an entertainment format, which is why it was such a great shame that it was followed by Sniper Elite 3, a game with about as much dignity and educational value as a hot fart in a cold lift. Yes, everyone's favourite head-exploding sniping simulator did to historical accuracy and respect what a round from a scoped M1 rifle does to a German soldier's eyeball. The North African front hasn't been well explored by video games, and, well, it still hasn't. The main campaign is only a handful of missions long, and its length only passes the 6-hour mark because of the frustrating difficulty afforded by obscure objectives and bionic super Nazis who can spot you from 3 miles away. While it attempts some adherence to actual history with the uniforms and weapons it gives to the player, I'm pretty sure you couldn't destroy Tiger tanks by shooting them in the back with a normal rifle, nor am I certain the Nazis were ever actually constructing a 20-metre mega tank in a secret hangar dug into the side of a mountain. But you get to run around shooting the men's until they all falls down, and there's lots of lovely exploding heads to cheer up the kids. I'm just saying Valiant Hearts was great without needing any of this, and since you ask, yes, I will marry it then. Oh, right, July. You want me to talk about July? You know, that's the month where the most exciting thing that came out was a re-release of a game that was popular a year ago. Fuck it, fine. Well, there was San Diego Comic-Con, probably the only gathering of thousands to be attended by more virgins than not outside of the Vatican City, but that wasn't exactly gaming related, and also I didn't go, so we won't be talking about that in case I smash the microphone in a jealous rage. Yeah, the only release in July was The Last of Us Remastered, 2013's hype receptacle warmed up and served again to the PS4 crowd. The game was already in HD and looked perfectly nice on the PlayStation 3, but the modern games industry can leave no property unmolested for long, so if you ever wanted to pay 50 quid to watch giraffes with slightly higher resolution than before and you don't live anywhere near a zoo, you can dig in, I suppose. To travel back to the lost temporal lands of 2012, do you remember a man called Jason Russell? No? The guy who made the Coney 2012 video that was going to cover the night and change the world for thousands of people? Well, he was later videoed running around screaming and smacking the pavement while naked. That is a perfect analogy, and I'm sorry, Jason, for using you, for what the games industry decided it was going to do to itself in August. This shitstorm in a teapot started when a developer, who I won't name, because it'll bring the horde down on my head, released a game called Depression Quest, a short text adventure game about her experiences with mental illness released on a pay-what-you-want basis. I actually played Depression Quest back when it was a Flash game in 2013 and thought it was a fairly decent idea executed rather simply, so it was some shock when sales of knicker-twisting machines went through the roof after its full release, claiming it was getting excessive praise. Then, an ex-boyfriend of hers made inflammatory claims about her love life online, and we might as well have given up on the internet then and there. I won't repeat them here, since frankly I can't waste the airtime on pointless tittle-tattle, but they led to somewhat unsubstantiated claims that she'd exchanged sex for positive coverage, which then snowballed into wholesale accusations of corruption in the games industry. On this point, I'd like to speak directly for a bit. If games journalism is one great big orgy, it's in a room which I've been kept well away from for my own safety as well as theirs. Secondly, they're basically right, there is corruption in games journalism. There are corrupt practices of blacklisting negative reviews, there's practices of giving away review copies only to favourable writers, and of only allowing critics to play polished sections of the game at the studio's headquarters, but what it isn't is a bunch of feminist writers and creators with a collective readership that couldn't fill a football stadium apparently having sex. But really, I'm wasting my breath. You all know what's happened since, with those articles titled Gamers Are Dead and the inevitable internet overreaction machines roaring into life. I predicted what would happen months ago when this all started, and it has everything to do with L'Oreal. When this story broke, I knew what would happen. The fires of Tumblr and 4chan would be lit as two great unthinking armies charged headlong into each other behind their preferred side almost as if by clockwork. That's where L'Oreal comes in. See, I've come to the realisation that so much of the arguments, the fighting, and the automatic knowledge of where everyone stands is based to a weird degree on physical stereotypes. To take the arguments of both sides as they see them, you have to imagine an army of shrill, neon-haired Tumblr users who'd rather commit seppuku than get within 10 feet of a man and want to ban any game that isn't about black trans women, facing off against a vast amorphous blob of Doritos, Trilbies and neckbeards who simultaneously want to shag every woman on Earth and slit their throats. If I've upset either side with those descriptions, that's entirely the point. The rhetoric is way past fever pitch, and it's not worth having the fight anymore because virtually no minds will by this point change. The two great unthinking blocks are locked in mortal warfare, but, and here's where one side does have the upper hand, the pool of people who care about games in a way that means they'd notice this is ever shrinking. In terms of significance to most people, it was less than two beetles fighting over a ball of dung until the bomb threat started being called in, so fuck off and calm down, all of you. Right, can we get back to talking about video games now? August's release schedule resembled the Sahara after a recent evacuation notice, save for one turd drawing everyone's attention from the desolation. Five Nights at Freddy's was a badly taped together video game which was to horror what a child's drawing of the sun is to the Hubble Space Telescope. It's part of the insipid sewage pipe of horror games which distill the gameplay down incredibly simply while chucking shit at the player's face in order to make them crap their pants. The thing is that they aren't doing it to make the player scared, oh no. They're doing it in the hopes that one of those inexplicable YouTube stars will play the game and pretend to be scared on their face cam, so all their 10-year-old viewers who clearly haven't been supervised enough in their childhood by their inattentive modern parents can go out and buy it from Steam and make them a quick buck. It's exploitative, destructive to real creativity, and flies in the face of everyone who wants video games to be seen as a legitimate art form, and I fucking hate it. I'm sorry for all the bile, I really am, but August pissed on my chips in a number of ways, and that's why September needed to be bloody brilliant. Fortunately, it was. The quenching rain of September fell in cannonball-sized drops launched from Poseidon's mighty trident, if I haven't completely overwrought this metaphor. First there was The Sims 4 at the beginning of the month, which attracted some criticism for stripping out the most random of features like pools and toddlers, with the seeming intent of putting them up for DLC purchase later. So far, so money-grabbing EA. But there was actually some pretty neat additions to the game too, like the emotional ways of performing actions. Essentially, The Sims is the steak and chips of video games, no matter how familiar it gets, and regardless of the fact that the chef keeps coming over to pester you to buy more, it's still fundamentally nice. Some astounding early technical requirements ended up being overestimates, and all in all they basically got away with it. It's an unfortunate reality of EA that the nature of their audience, perhaps less connected with gaming news and current affairs than that of other companies, means they get away with all the dodgier things they do, like charging insane prices to actually be able to play Dungeon Keeper for mobiles, and people will not notice or care. In summary, our species is doomed. But speaking of doomed humanity, the really explosively big release of September was Destiny, the sort of MMO, sort of shooter, sort of sci-fi epics from Halo developers Bungie. It captured the imaginations of the public like a Saturday morning cartoon villain might and sold well into the millions, proving the old adage that if you market anything hard enough you'll make your money back. The game took place after the downfall of humanity, as survivors protected by a celestial being known only as the Traveller sally forth from mankind's last remaining city to rebuild after a catastrophic collapse. A cheerful one then, and a story well worth telling even if the player's AI buddy wasn't voiced by Peter Dinklage in some of the most blatant stunt casting in years. Aside from the odd glitch resulting from the online nature of the game, it turned out pretty decently and seems to have neatly attached itself to the timeline of Bungie, rescuing their reputation after they stopped developing Halo. Planetary Annihilation launched on the 5th of September, 5 years after its initial conception, but after amassing millions of dollars on Kickstarter, truly the world's begging bowl by this point. Still, its stated aim of 1 million on-screen units is impressive, and the galaxy-wide conflict is a type of strategy game never before attempted on this scale. Hyrule Warriors was a unique take on the Dynasty Warriors spectacle fighting concept in which two armies do battle while the player's superpowered characters plough through them like Miley Cyrus riding a wrecking ball. It featured all sorts of weird and wonderful characters from the Zelda canon, from the typical Link, Zelda, Ganondorf, through to the weird like Princess Ruto and Agatha the Butterfly Girl, whose previous appearances included one very annoying side quest in a game which came out 8 years ago. It was one of the better selling Wii U games, although that's not saying much since a bestseller on the Wii U means the developer occasionally managed to get their mum to take a copy out of pity. Still fun to slice up the occasional Stalfos if you're sick enough to enjoy that sort of thing, you monster. In gaming news in September, the industry continued to shit all over itself as detailed earlier, but there was an even bigger shitstorm midway through the month as Microsoft announced its intention to purchase Mojang, the developers of Minecraft and official kings of gaming, for $2.5 billion. Other than Marcus Persson, otherwise known as Notch, who was now rich enough to buy a diamond blowjob machine and a house on Mars, this was pretty universally seen as a bad thing. Players everywhere envisaged Clippy the Paperclip popping up in block form to tell them it looked like they were trying to build a house, and those people who build working computers in Minecraft would only be able to run Bing and Games for Windows Live, which incidentally was rumoured to be shutting down this year, although Microsoft denied it. 250,000 people descended on Chiba, Japan in September for the Tokyo Game Show, at which were trailed ever more instalments of the Tales of series, with Tales of Hearts R and Tales of Zestiria making an appearance. It was also when we heard about Project Morpheus, Sony's answer to the Oculus Rift, that heralds the dawning of an incredibly annoying age of mutually incompatible VR headsets for different systems. Oh joy. Oh, and Kingdom Hearts 2.5, which in the grand tradition of that series' incomprehensible names isn't a midway point between the inevitable Kingdom Hearts 3 and the pretty decent second game, but actually just an HD re-release of the latter with a smattering of extra content. I actually quite liked Kingdom Hearts 2, but after that Sephiroth fight, I doubt I'll be able to play it again without testing the Guinness World Record for furthest controller flinging. And while we're in September, let's say a big happy birthday to Naughty Dog, creators of Crash Bandicoot, Uncharted, and The Last of Us, who this year celebrated their 30th anniversary. This isn't because one of their high-ups follows me on Twitter, I promise. Oh, and we couldn't go on without touching on the vanishing of Ethan Carter, a rather beautiful if slow adventure game from Polish developers The Astronauts, who under their previous name of People Can Fly were responsible for Bulletstorm and Painkiller, two very different games indeed. After brief investigation, the fairly short game tells the story of the most fucked up gaming family situation since the Mario brothers shacked up together. As we barrel towards the end of the year like an out-of-control school bus hurtling towards a ravine, October provided a comforting speed bump, slowing down our inevitable aging, death and destruction, by distracting us with lots of new games. Here are some of them. Obviously, the first major release was Super Smash Bros. For 3DS, the newest installment of Nintendo's venerable fighting game series, which had fans literally wetting their pants in excitement. Well, I say with excitement, I mean we know Nintendo fans are all 2 years old, so it might have been something else. This time around we had a proper online system that didn't suffer too much from lag, and a truly impressive range of characters, although with some sad exceptions such as Mother 3's Lucas missing. The stages were well built, but the 3DS screen isn't the best format for this sort of thing, and the handheld layout wasn't built for this sort of strain. This led to several incidents of people tearing their 3DS circle pads off. It wasn't perfect, and Melee still reigns supreme, but there is nothing better for grabbing the nearest baseball bat and clubbing the hell out of Greninja, the stupid new Pokemon interloper. After that was Alien Isolation, a love letter and apology to the people put off by bland glitch-fest Colonial Marines. A genuinely adrenaline-filled sneaking about simulator, this saw players stalked by a single deadly alien. I'm no fan of stealth games, but this got the survival genre down to its bare bones in a way something like Five Nights at Freddy's never could, and was a fitting tribute to the most famous creation of H.R. Geiger, who sadly left us this year. The same day, one of Tim Schafer's least appreciated creations received a sequel in the form of Costume Quest 2, a time-travelling cartoon RPG which took more than a single leaf from Earthbound's book and was all the better for it. Project Spark was a simple bit of game creation software released for the Microsoft systems in October, which gave players the ability to chuck all sorts of physics objects into a pile to try and break whatever machine they were running it on, or if they weren't me, try and make adventures of their own. It went further than Little Big Planet's tools ever have and was better for it, so well done I suppose. Rise, Son of Rome has been about for long enough that it got a mention in last year's Review of the Year video as well, and was just about as generic and bland as you could have expected, but rendered all the worse by having a stupidly long install time thanks to day one patches which should have been fixed before release. Borderlands the pre-sequel found itself out before you could say cash cow, and the evil within made an abortive attempt to be the new Resident Evil 4 while doing almost nothing the same as Resident Evil 4. The Fear series continued to roll around drunk in the gutter by bringing out an online sequel for people who don't understand the lonely nature of horror, and Just Dance 2015 came out to make me look like a marionette dangled from a sailing ship in a hurricane. But there was at least one more gem in the month of October, as Dreamfall Chapters finally saw release after a successful Kickstarter campaign. The continuation of a story which began in 1999 with the release of The Longest Journey began to draw to a close, and fans of old adventure games were duly thrilled with the combination of obscure items to solve straightforward problems. To get my serious games journalism face on for a second, there were genuine moments of comedic brilliance in the writing, and Zoe Castillo deserves some sort of award for the best representation of women in gaming in years. The graphics were sumptuous and the world's well built, with lots of natural looking features like buskers you can really ignore and a realistic election campaign ongoing throughout. It's a series well worth checking out, and with the 3 games available for a collective price lower than the latest Call of Duty, you'd have to be bloody stupid not to. Fantasy Life came out on 3DS from the same people who brought you the lovely graphical style of Mother 3, and Bayonetta 2 raised some questions in the pants of 12-year-old boys, which their parents will have to awkwardly answer later. Still, it was nice to see a Wii U exclusive, and the addition of the first game as well only sweetened the deal. Civilization Beyond Earth had been heavily hyped and advertised, but had some rather significant flaws, not least of which was the basic concept. In normal Civilization games, part of the satisfaction comes from the gradual progression from known ancient technology through to the modern day and slightly beyond. But in Beyond Earth, the player starts the game with technology 500 years ahead of where we are now, and it's hard to appreciate the difference between one futuristic power source and another when both are miles ahead of what we currently own. Still, it had some neat features. The ability to merge with the planet and morph into an entirely different species to the horror of the human purist factions was an interesting addition, and the creation of a real skill tree with multiple different branches was the natural progression of an already good idea. To round off the month was Sunset Overdrive, a game in which everything appears to be made of stretched out rubber and bungee cord for the amount of bouncing around the characters do. Focused on an apocalypse caused by a contaminated energy drink, it was mooted as a potential boost for Xbox One sales, but ended up just giving us all the jitters. The home stretch appeared before us like a sheer mountain face before a fog-blinded light aircraft, and the sickening crunch of November's impact came with the release of Call of Duty: Advanced Warfare. Having abandoned any pretense of trying to tell a decent story somewhere around the midpoint of Modern Warfare 2, Advanced Warfare is set at some point in the moderately near future and features Kevin Spacey and an army of mercenaries trying to take over the world for some reason. Oh, look, jetpacks! Yeah, you can hop around while shooting now, like the Easter Bunny when he got sick of everyone's shit. And, well, it's a Call of Duty game, there's not that much to say about it anymore. If you already like it, then my words don't mean a thing, and if you don't like it, then I'm just adding to your echo chamber. It's perfectly functional and it doesn't really harm anyone, but it's just so dull. Speaking of dull, the wits of the people who put out an entirely broken game must rank pretty highly, and the people responsible for Assassin's Creed Unity are no exception. What promised to be a gloriously violent romp through the streets of revolutionary France was rendered hilarious by a plague of disappearing faces, frame rate drops, and all manner of other bugs. As an apology, Ubisoft offered a bunch of free DLC before hurriedly trying to shove its battered corpse under the rug by announcing that the next game in the series will be set in Victorian London, which presumably will be as racist as Assassin's Creed 3 and feature a hunky freedom-loving American assassinating a bunch of lovable Cockney chimney sweeps, Jack the Ripper, and the inexplicable apparent pretty boy portrayed by bumblefuck cunter twatch, but now we're just into my personal prejudices. Games being produced to incredibly tight deadlines and consequently finding themselves rushed isn't a new phenomenon, but it's a particularly annoying one, and the danger in it going wrong is proportionally heightened as major game budgets rise. Surely our society isn't one in which people are so desperate for products that waiting 5 minutes so that something has more of a sense of accomplishment when you finally get it results in fists and hospitalisation. Surely Ubisoft could learn that consumers are generally reasonable, patient, tolerant people who... Oh, right. The day the American invasion of Britain started will be marked not with the day the paratroopers landed in Taunton, but with Black Friday 2014. The cacophony of consumerism has been a regular feature of Thanksgiving, or Thursday as smarter countries call it, for years, but only this year made its way in full violent glory to this storied island, replete with as much shoving, grabbing and gouging as a retailer is allowed to do with their customers' money. Seriously though, I doubt much of it, with the exception of discounted consoles, was video game related. The retail video games market has become so depleted and monopolised by supermarkets by this point that the only way people were grabbing software was if they turned up after the TVs, white goods and dignity had all been taken. Also out in November was Sonic Boom, a duo of games released for the Wii U and 3DS that were once marked as the rebirth of Sonic into a franchise people could learn to love again, and they pulled it off brilliantly. Sonic and Pals have had a complete redesign, especially Knuckles, whose designers evidently misheard him being referred to as this shithead, and interpreted it as Brick Shithouse. They've also given the team lots of new powers. They can fly endlessly, they can clone themselves, they can clip through solid objects, they can get stuck at will. Such brilliance in game design is unlikely to be repeated in our lifetime, and frankly it's astounding. Halo, the Master Chief Collection, came out, but frankly since it consists mainly of games which were already released years ago, you can go bugger yourself with a barge pole if you think I'm reviewing it properly. After LEGO Batman 3, which we'll move past as quickly as possible, there was This War of Mine, a rather thoughtful Polish game which addressed the odd trope in video games of only warriors from either side being present in most firefights. Far Cry 4 was just Far Cry 3 with more elephants, but Grand Theft Auto 5's release for the next-gen console market caused more controversy than it deserved by being pulled from shelves at Australian Target and Kmart stores. After a petition by people concerned about the game's depiction of violence against women, it garnered 40,000 signatures. Frankly, I think they're wrong and more to the point counterproductive, but also the inevitable massive backlash was indulged in by far more people than ever would have bought the game from either of those two stores, which still would have been the case if only 5 people had complained, let's be honest. Sheffield-based developers Sumo Digital brought out Little Big Planet 3 and added more than just Sackboys as playable characters, in addition to the rather nice bonus of being able to transfer over content from the previous games. At this point, Little Big Planet is becoming somewhat of a mascot for Sony, whose success this year has been pretty perpetual, with sales of the PS4 holding steadily high in first place, although the less said about the Vita, the better. Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, let players slice up orcs like a Thanksgiving turducken, that is, ineptly and dangerously. I can't help but feel that the unrelentingly violent nature of the game somewhat spits in the face of J.R.R. Tolkien's storytelling ability, but at the same time nobody gives a shit what I think, so do what you want, I suppose. There were a bunch of other games released late in November, but none would take the spotlight away from Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, 3DS remakes of the Game Boy Advance classics which transformed the land of Hoenn into an adventure which was at once familiar and fresh, like returning to an ex-lover for one last flog of the moribund horse. The games added new nonsense like Mega Evolution to the games and generally felt a bit dumbed down, as the experience share is now acquired early and helps all Pokemon in the party, while cutscenes now replace most standard conversations in a way I'm not sure adds to any kind of natural feel or immersion. There are also some technical details which should have been foreseen. The map of Hoenn harks from 2002 and was not designed with 3D graphics in mind. This obviously isn't a failing of the original designers, but it was pretty easy not to be able to work out where to go or not. The camera also pulls in frustratingly close with no way to change its angle or zoom level, so running into hidden trainers is annoyingly common and resulted in my being wiped out at least twice. There's also something inherently wrong still about moving Pokemon characters in full 360 degrees, and the addition of some loading transitions when there before were none sat wrong with my muscle memory of the games, but that's just nitpicking at this point. But do I like it? Yes. It captures the spirit of the originals well, and despite its flaws, it's still lovely to explore the watery region of Hoenn in a vain attempt to catch 'em all. Especially compared to the frankly lacking X and Y, there are far worse Pokemon games you could buy. Super Smash Bros. For Wii U bumbled back onto the scene like a drunk who's made it home after 5 hours in a ditch. It escapes me entirely why they released 2 games in the first place apart from the obvious explanation of the Pokemon motivation, i.e. money, but if they were going to, they could have at least bothered to do them both on the same day. Next month, please. The release schedule has actually been pretty bare in December proper, with the only release close to major being the Mario spin-off Captain Toad, a game with as much self-respect it didn't even refer to Mario in the title, like the kart, golf, tennis, paper and Luigi series have been afraid not to do. Toad's the epitome of cool, really. He does what he has to do, including acting as an unwilling human shield for Peach in Smash Bros, without much protest or glory-seeking. He's just great, and I don't care if that's a bland opinion, I've written 8,000 words of this bloody script by now. Of course, the major news at the start of December was not a festive one. At the not inconsiderable age of 92, Ralph H. Baer died. Known as the father of video games for his invention of the so-called brown box, which later became the Magnavox Odyssey, it was the first ever prototype for a home games console. Released in 1972, it was the precursor to everything we now play. It's difficult to overstate the importance of Ralph Baer's creation. Without the brown box, we'd have had no Nintendo, no Mega Drive, no PlayStation, which incidentally celebrated its 20th anniversary this month, no GameCube, no Xbox, no modern gaming whatsoever. So thank you, Ralph. May the initials RHB sit at the top of gaming's high scoreboard for a long time yet. So what's the year been like overall? Well, like a brand new puppy, it's been energetic, tiring, and occasionally it shits on the carpet. But the indie boom continues unabated. We're starting to get new and better releases for the new generation of consoles, and the market has expanded so far and so wide that we're almost guaranteed to continue our forward march to the better, smarter, more amazing gaming of the future. So, thank you for joining me. Merry Christmas to all, and to all good fucking night.